Maggie Carter stood at the edge of the Hutchins Orchard block on a cold February morning in 1992, watching a crew fell one twisted old pear tree after another, the trunks coming down short and crooked, branched low, nothing like the straight timber a sawmill would ever bother loading onto a truck. "You want these?" the orchard foreman asked, a lean man named Del Ashby, who'd managed the block for the better part of 2 decades. "We're pulling about 400 trees this replant. Most of it goes straight to the chipper or the burn pile. Trunks are too short and too crooked to mill anything worth the trouble." "I'd like the usable ones." Del shrugged. "Your call. I'll tell you now, though, we tried selling logs off this same orchard to a mill a few years back. Fella took one look and said crooked pear wood makes crooked, cracked boards, wasn't worth his blade time." Maggie thanked him anyway and arranged to haul what she could over the following weeks. Nobody standing in that orchard that morning could have told you why a 27-year-old running a repair shop out of a converted barn wanted 400 short, twisted pear trunks that a professional sawmill had already passed on. Not Del, not the crew loading the chipper, not even, if she was honest, Maggie herself, not with any real certainty, not yet. Del wasn't wrong about what those trunks couldn't do. He was only thinking about what they were supposed to become. Within 2 years, Maggie would have just over $250,000 in cumulative sales built on wood that same sawmill had refused to even quote, though on that February morning, she had no idea what shape that would take. Maggie ran her father's old repair and fabrication shop on the family's small acreage, the same converted barn, the same tools, the same habit of measuring twice before she ever touched a saw. She kept his 6-inch steel machinist ruler in her shirt pocket, worn smooth from his hands before hers. She'd taken an interest in pear wood the way she took an interest in most materials, because it was there, cheap, and she suspected it was being wasted for reasons that had more to do with shape than with quality. Fruitwood had a reputation among the handful of woodworkers she knew. Dense, fine-grained, attractive when finished, the kind of wood that showed up in specialty catalogs at prices that made ordinary lumber look cheap by comparison. The repair shop covered her bills most months, but not by much, not after equipment payments and the property taxes that came due twice a year on land her father had left her outright, but hadn't left her any easier way to keep. A side project that turned useless material into real income wasn't a hobby to her. It was the kind of margin that decided whether a slow winter meant tight or meant trouble. Her first idea was straightforward, maybe too straightforward. She'd mill the trunks into boards, same as she would any log, and sell the lumber the normal way, by the board foot. She spent 3 weeks that spring milling what usable trunk sections she could get square on her small bandsaw mill, the saw laboring through crotches and knots that a straight log would never have presented, fresh pear sawdust piling up sweet-smelling around her boots. She stacked the resulting boards with stickers between them in a shed to air dry, the same method her father had used on every log that ever came through the shop. Weeks later, the results told her Del hadn't been exaggerating. The end grain on nearly every board had checked badly, deep cracks running inches down from each end before she'd even gotten them fully dry. Boards that looked sound coming off the saw twisted and cupped as they dried, some of them badly enough to be unusable for anything requiring a flat surface. Where the trunks had branched or curved, the grain ran short and unpredictable through the board, weak spots that split further under the lightest stress. She could hear it sometimes, walking through the shed on a dry afternoon, a faint ticking crack as another board let go somewhere along its length. By the time she'd finished evaluating the stack, Maggie figured she'd gotten maybe 15% usable board footage out of the whole batch. Against the time on the mill, the blade wear from cutting knotty, twisted logs, the labor of stacking and restacking, and a shed full of storage space tied up for a return that didn't come close to covering the cost. For a stretch of weeks that spring, it genuinely looked like Del had been right all along. Crooked pear wood made crooked, cracked boards, exactly as the sawmill had told him years before. Maggie didn't haul the failed stack to the burn pile, though. She spent an evening going through it board by board instead, the way her father had taught her to study a failure rather than bury it, a single shop light hanging over the bench and a legal pad beside her hand for notes. What she found, once she looked past the cracked ends and warped lengths, was that the wood between the defects, the small clear sections free of knots and checking, was genuinely beautiful material. Dense, tight, fine grain, smooth under a hand plane in a way that surprised her, almost polished looking after just a few passes. The kind of wood that would take a crisp edge and hold detail if you were shaping something small and precise instead of trying to keep a long board flat. She sat with that thought for a while, turning a clear offcut over in her hands under the shop light, running her thumbnail across the grain the way she'd watched her father check wood 100 times before. She'd been trying to force short, twisted trunks into a product that demanded long, straight material. The trunks weren't ever going to cooperate with that, but nobody had asked whether pear wood needed to become lumber at all. Over the following months, Maggie shifted her whole approach, working with the material's actual scale instead of fighting it. She started cutting shorter blanks straight out of clear sections of trunk, 6 to 10 inches typically, well short of anything a lumberyard would recognize as a board, but plenty long enough for a knife handle, a tool handle, a small carved piece, a specialty kitchen utensil. She sealed the end grain immediately after cutting this time, a coat of wax emulsion brushed on within hours instead of days, slowing the moisture loss that had caused so much of the checking in her first attempt. She dried the blanks far more slowly than she had the boards, stacked loosely with airflow between them in a cool corner of the shop instead of rushed through a warm shed. She sorted ruthlessly by grain and defect before drying even started, setting aside anything with a knot, a check, or unstable figure, keeping only the clearest material for the process at all. It took months to see whether the approach actually worked. She kept a simple log on a clipboard nailed inside the shop door, batch number, cut date, moisture readings taken every couple of weeks, so she'd know exactly how each group of blanks was drying instead of guessing. When she checked the moisture content on a batch that winter with a meter she'd bought secondhand and split a few test blanks to look for internal cracking, she found what she'd hoped for. Stable, sound, dense little blocks of pear wood, dried properly, with almost none of the checking and warping that had ruined her first attempt at full-length boards. She brought a box of finished blanks to Roe Hendricks, a knife maker who ran a small shop 2 towns over and had a reputation locally for particular taste in handle material. Roe turned a few blanks over under his shop light, checking the grain, running a thumbnail across the surface, weighing one in his palm. "Fruitwood's good stuff when it's actually dry and stable," he said. "Most of what people bring me isn't either one. This is dense, grain's tight. How much do you have? Depends what you need." He ordered a modest batch that first time, 30 blanks, cautious the way a craftsman is cautious with an unfamiliar supplier. He tested them over the following weeks, cutting, shaping, checking how the material machined and how it held up once worked into finished handles. His second order came a month later, twice the size of the first, along with a comment that mattered more to Maggie than the order itself. The wood hadn't moved on him after machining, no warping, no surprise cracks showing up after the fact. That stability, more than anything else, was what he was actually paying for. The economics, once Maggie worked them out properly, explained exactly why the shift mattered. As firewood or chipper waste, that Pear orchard's 400 trees were worth close to nothing, maybe scrap value covering the cost of removal at best. As conventional lumber, milled the way she'd first tried, her actual usable yield had been so poor that the board foot value barely covered her labor. But a clear 6-inch pear blank, properly dried and sorted, sold to a specialty buyer for $4 to $8 apiece, and a single crooked trunk that might have yielded less than $10 of usable rough lumber could easily produce a dozen or more clear short blanks, once she stopped insisting on length. $60 or $70 of finished material out of wood that had almost gone to the burn pile. Per pound of usable wood, the specialty blanks were worth several times what the lumber attempt had ever managed, and the offcuts too short or narrow, even for handle blanks, went into smaller products still, carving stock, small box panels, more of the clear material finding a use than her first attempt had ever managed, even if the defective sections still went to fuel or chips the same as always. Maggie spent the next 2 years building the operation into something repeatable rather than a one-time salvage project. The Hutchins trunks got her started, but 400 trees, even sorted carefully, only stretched so far against growing demand. Word of what she was doing reached a couple of other orchard operations in the valley by that first summer, smaller replant jobs mostly, apple and cherry alongside more pear, and Maggie began taking on their culled trunks the same way, sorting hard, keeping only what met her standard. She developed size grades, standard blank dimensions sorted by length and cross-section, so a buyer could order by category instead of picking through mismatched pieces. She set moisture standards, testing every batch before it left the shop, and built simple drying racks designed specifically for short blanks instead of full boards, airflow on all sides, easy to load and unload as material moved through the process. Word passed the way it usually did among craftsmen who talked to each other more than most trades realized. One knife maker mentioning his supplier to another at a show, a woodworking supplier hearing about stable fruitwood blanks and placing an inquiry of his own. Maggie's customer list grew slowly across those 2 years, knife makers first, then a couple of specialty woodworking suppliers who bought in bulk to resell, then individual craftsmen doing small carving and kitchen tool work who wanted material in quantities too small for the suppliers to bother with directly. By the end of that second full year, between direct sales to craftsmen, wholesale orders to suppliers, and the steady trickle of smaller individual orders, Maggie's Pear wood operation had brought in just over $250,000 in cumulative gross sales, built on the model that first batch of crooked trunks had taught her, before material costs, blade wear, drying losses, and the labor of running it all herself. It wasn't take-home profit, and she never pretended otherwise when anyone asked. But it was real, repeatable revenue from wood that orchards across the valley had once paid to have hauled away. It hadn't happened in a season. It had happened one dried blank, one repeat order, one referral at a time. Del Ashby called her again in the fall, ahead of another block replant at the same orchard, several hundred more aging pear trees scheduled to come out that winter. "Figured I'd ask before we just chip these like last time," he said. "What's it worth to you? Same terms as before, or you want to talk price now that you've got a business running off the last batch?" Maggie didn't gloat about it, and Del didn't seem to expect her to. They settled on a fair number for the coming trunks, better than what she'd paid the first time, still well under what either of them would have called expensive. She drove out that afternoon to walk the new block before the crew started cutting, running her father's ruler along the trunk of one particularly twisted old tree, checking the diameter the way she checked everything, out of habit as much as need. Back at the shop that evening, she set a short, flawless pear blank on the workbench beside a section of the original crooked trunk it had come from, the twisted log still bearing every curve and knot that had made it useless to a sawmill years before. The tree wasn't too small. The product was too big.